Hey there, this is Fritz Westover, your viticulturist here at Virtual Viticulture Academy and with the Vineyard Underground podcast. And like always, I'm getting more questions from the field from growers like you. This question's coming in time for the dormant pruning season. It's a question from Rusty in Texas, and he has questions about when he should start with his rough pruning and final pruning. So let's go ahead and look at his question and see if we can help him out. I'd love to answer this question and hope that it's going to help some of you other growers out there as well. So here we go. The question from Rusty is a 4-part question. So I'll just work through these one at a time. The first question is, does it matter what order rough pruning occurs? In other words, should early bud break varieties be rough pruned last? Or maybe it doesn't matter because we're going to be fine pruning within a month. Really, the order of pruning for rough pruning is not as important, Rusty. And for those of you not familiar with rough pruning or pre-pruning, it's called sometimes, that's where the grower goes through and removes about 50 or 60% of the cane, the top portion, and leaves the lower portion of the cane so that you can use that to go and final prune on later, and it takes the bulk of the canes out of the canopy. So in other words, it makes the final pruning go faster by getting rid of a lot of the clutter in the canopy. And typically, I like to start doing this once you see the vines have gone into complete dormancy. So all the leaves have dropped and the vines are completely dormant. That could be in the Northern Hemisphere, anywhere in mid to late December, or even anytime in December if you get an early freeze. Certainly, you could start as soon as you get into the new year in January. So it doesn't matter so much the order that you rough prune the vines, but I would say just to be consistent, if you normally prune your late bud burst varieties first, because they have later bud burst, and pruning them first could possibly stimulate earlier bud burst, right? So we're going to do the late bud varieties first. The late bud burst varieties on our final pruning will come first. You can do those first with your rough pruning as well. And that way you're keeping a consistent order from your rough pruning that carries over to your final pruning. I think it's logical, even if it's not necessary. I think it's logical and makes sense and helps kind of drive into you and your team the order of operations. And then the next question is by Rusty, is January 3rd too early to start rough pruning in North Texas? And then we will fine prune beginning at the latest budding, oldest varieties. And then, of course, Rusty sent me a little schematic of that. So I do not think that January is too early to start your rough pruning, as I just mentioned. And I think the idea is you need to figure out how long it's going to take you to rough prune your vineyard and try to get that done about a week, maybe 2 weeks ahead of when you're going to start your final pruning. You don't need to treat any of your wounds on your rough prune vines because they're not final pruning cuts. So disease entering through those rough pruning cuts should not be an issue. It's the final pruning wounds that we want to protect. So you can start, depending on when your final pruning is going to start, you can set your clock on when you're going to start your rough pruning, Rusty. But the next question, part 3, is February 4th in this example for North Texas too early to start fine pruning? Bud break is usually March 17th through April 5th, with an average last frost around March 29th. So it sounds like you would benefit, Rusty, from having a little delayed bud break because sometimes your earliest bud break is before your last spring freeze. So I would say if you can delay pruning, final pruning as long as possible, figure out how long it's going to take you to prune your vineyard and work backwards from that. Allow probably 7 to 14 days of extra time in case bud burst comes early or in case you have some rainy weather, because we can't prune during rainy weather. It's bad for causing spread of diseases to pruning wounds from your vineyard. So I would say go out and practice prune a few vines, see how long it takes you to actually prune those. If it's you who's doing the pruning yourself, you and your team, and then you can work backwards based on that. Remember, as you prune, you're going to get faster during the season. So going out and pruning as some example vines is going to give you probably a longer window than is necessary for your actual final pruning to occur. You could also do some activities like laying canes down. If you have young vines, you can lay canes down as extensions for cordons or to create cordons or to develop trunks. That can be done as early as January, and we don't worry about it stimulating any bud burst. Your final pruning, though, I would say you probably want to get started in February if it's going to take you a month to 5 weeks to final prune. That's going to get you done about a week to 10 days before your earliest anticipated bud burst date. So you'll need to decide that, but I'm giving you some guidelines to give you an idea of how you come up with that final number. And then the fourth question is this too long for pruning, as in too long between rough pruning and final pruning. So the question is really, does there need to be a certain amount of time between the completion of rough pruning and when you initiate your final pruning? And the answer to that is no, you really don't need any defined period of time. The idea that I have is you should get in and rough prune and be done with that roughly a week or so before you start your final pruning. And your final pruning should start in time to finish before bud burst, but you want to delay it as long as possible, because delaying pruning, final pruning, will delay the onset of bud burst. And I do agree, you should start with your late bud burst varieties first, and then work into your early bud burst varieties last, because you want to further delay the early bud burst of those varieties. So Rusty, I hope this is helpful for you. I hope it's going to result in you putting some calendars or some dates rather on the calendar for pruning. And thanks for checking in. For those of you who'd like to get more information on grape growing, you could visit virtualviticultureacademy.com, and please listen in on the Vineyard Underground podcast. You can check that out anywhere you listen to podcasts, or check it out at vineyardundergroundpodcast.com. If you go there and click the Ask Fritz button, you can send any of your grape growing questions to me, and I'll be sure to give you a response. Thanks again.